Hello and welcome back to the Mythic Dungeon International for our final weekend, not only for the East, but also for our summer season. Here we have already looked at which teams have been qualifying for BlizzCon, and now we'll have our final weekend to start seeing what else that they are made of. Hello, I'm Jack, and joining me at the desk, we've got Sloot, Nagura, and Tettles. And my friends, after we've seen a whole bunch of competition throughout the summer and spring seasons, we now know who our BlizzCon teams are going to be. We've got 4 from the West and then 2 from the East. And looking at how Team D in particular is shaken up, they're not going to be here with us today, unfortunately, Sloot, but they have put on quite a show in that spring season, earning themselves that qualification for BlizzCon.
Yeah, it just really shows how strong of a team they were to be able to, basically pre-qualify for BlizzCon at the strength that they did. So, kudos to them. I just hope for their sake that they're able to kind of get everything together, re-synergize the team, and get ready properly for BlizzCon.
That's right, as they did have one of their players having surgery, so he was unable to compete on this weekend or the last. So Buff-War Nerf Rogue, in many cases, has also gone pretty uncontested in the Eastern region. Black Mamba's kind of tried a little bit, Tettles. The Buff-War Nerf Rogue has really stood out this season.
Yeah, I think in general there's just a separation between the skill of Buff-War Nerf Rogue and Black Mamba, and even like the rest of the East. We saw Team D and Buff-War Nerf Rogue. They were kind of competitive as well, so it's going to be interesting to see if Buff-War Nerf Rogue continues like their level of practice and their level of skill moving forward into like this BlizzCon, because they have qualified on points already.
That's right. Let's take a look at our bracket to get ourselves started for the day. Now, Buff-War Nerf Rogue as that #1 seed will be starting us off, going up against Oldnscuffed. Then we've got our King of Ruins and Bluebird, and Black Mamba and Big Money Crab. One last chance, unfortunately, had to forfeit, so Team 430 is getting that bye, and they will await the winners between Black Mamba and Big Money Crab onto that one. So Buff-War Nerf Rogue versus Oldnscuffed. And on this one, Dagor, we've seen last week, there's a lot of teams that are already qualifying for BlizzCon. People are trying to experiment with some, maybe they're going to go into their comfort picks of what they like to play on live servers. We've also seen a little bit more experimentation out of people as they're kind of relaxing and, in some cases, just seeing how far they can push certain classes.
Yeah, so Buff-War Nerf Rogue, they've definitely shown this season specifically that they improved so much, and they've already qualified, they've earned their points, right, with their roster swap, with the Supreme coming in. They just seem to be a very well-rounded team and very improved. So they've earned their right to try out some new classes, some new comps maybe. We will see what they do. And as you mentioned, Method U, for example, showing some very interesting comps last weekend. So we'll see what Buff-War Nerf Rogue does this time around.
And I think it was always a very fun thing to be able to bring up, because we're so used to seeing these very strict meta classes every single time. And so we saw on display last week where it's so much emphasis is put on the execution to be able to pull those things off, that even if you're bringing some off-meta classes, you're not that much slower.
Look, let's just call it what it is. Yeah, of course, rogues are very strong. They have a lot of utility, but that doesn't mean that you cannot do these kind of speed dungeons or, of course, live keys, extending it even further with other classes and still perform at a top level. Method U is a top caliber team. They can execute everything properly, and they showed that, as you said, Jack, with proper execution and skill, you don't need to have a 3-row comp or something like that to win. They blew out their first series.
That's exactly right, and let's get ourselves looking at the match ahead as Buff-War Nerf Rogue be facing off against Oldnscuffed, and we're bringing it on into the Freehold.
Into the Freehold we go, and this Freehold we usually talk about, it's a nice...
It's a Boomkin.
Trash... let's put that aside for a second. It's a nice trash-rich dungeon, but, one of the things that I want to point out, actually, Nagura, it might tend into this Boomkin right now, is that we're in a bolstering environment. Bolstering and Freehold are very mean together. So, what are really the strengths of this Boomkin, other than, hugging the floor like you do a lot?
Sorry, I'm still trying to recover seeing a Boomkin here for the first time in a long time. And look at that beautiful point of view as well. As you can see, Supreme actually casting Star Surge when there's 10 mobs. So I wish there was an AoE ability that Boomkin had that did damage. Anyway.
Some kind of starry ability with a massive radius.
Anyway, so the beauty about Unholy BK doing so much burst AoE is that you don't need anyone else doing AoE damage, and you can actually have... So, okay. No jokes aside, if you have a DK doing so much AoE damage on a bolstering environment, the Boomkin will actually help quite a bit, because he's the one just single targeting the mobs that are higher HP and actually evening out the damage on everything. And the Rogue is doing the same thing, right? So unfortunately, on the other side, Oldnscuffed, they have a huge team wipe going in as they were trying to do this very first pull, while Buff-War Nerf Rogue seems to do it pretty well as they're finishing up the first pull. But they bolstered some of those enforcers quite a bit.
Yeah, and for Oldnscuffed here, it's nice actually actually mash the rest of the ended up shadow melding all of that aggro off. So they did have 4 deaths, but they did kind of recover because we do know they skipped the Void Emissary at the beginning of the dungeon. So a bit fortunate for them there, as Buff War still dealing with these very heavily enforced enforces really from the bolstering. Now, you know, we were kind of joking at the start, but one of the strengths of Boomkins here is, as you mentioned, to kind of offset and balance the fact that bolstering is here and the Unholy DK is in here and just really doesn't care what he's hitting as long as things around him are getting mass AoE. So Supreme doing a good enough job of that on the previous wave, but a bit of mismanagement with the Enforcer as Buff Warrior starts up on Sky Captain Craig here. Now, we are in a fortified environment, as we've seen in previous weeks, so Sky Captain Craig certainly has a lot of high damage and high burst potential that we've seen in previous weeks, but certainly not at the level of Tyrannical, where I believe on an 18, even at their gear level, there's a chance that they can one-shot you.
Yeah, most definitely. And then, I mean, Boomkin also has a very high single target damage. Boomkins are very good in raids in general, just because the single target damage is really high. And you can see Supreme definitely is doing a lot of damage here as well. Now, of course, he's not going to go full single target essences, full single target talents and traits, because he needs to do some AoE damage too. So he would do even more if he would be completely single target focused. But on a fortified dungeon, that's probably not really what you want to go for. Anyway, you know, they're working on first boss, and you can see Supreme actually making use of the fact that you can stand outside of the arena as a ranged DPS, and you can just avoid all of the mechanics basically. Unfortunately, Supreme was standing too close, and he actually got hit by this powder shot from the boss. But you can completely outrange this, just like Loda does as well. But if you stand outside of the arena, you don't even get hit by this poop that the green pulls on the floor the bird throws on somebody. So as a ranged DPS, you can stand outside and basically not worry about anything whatsoever.
Yes, the life of a ranged DPS, as Sky Captain Craig down here to 16% for Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue. Oldenscuffed is working on the same boss right now, 66%. Now, let's check in for a moment with the trash percentages. Buff Warrior did a substantially larger pull and executed it properly, putting them to 14%. Now, to be fair, that's not anywhere near the percent that we see some of the Western teams do, but we are in a bolstering environment, which substantially limits the amount of mass pull size you can do and really just kind of artificially inflates the dungeon clear time. Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue has finished off the first boss and is starting to head over to the bridge guarded by that one Enforcer, as Oldenscuffed is now at 45% on Sky Captain Craig and makes sure to move out of the way of the Parrot coming down for another dive. So Oldenscuffed definitely already on the back foot, and you know, of course, it's already worth mentioning the 4 deaths on the board too, but they have their work cut out for them here. Yeah,
most definitely. And this is a very similar story to what we've seen Method EU do last weekend, right? They were showing this very interesting comp, and everyone was laughing at it and thinking they would lose. And it was a Freehold as well that they were playing with the Disc Freeze, for example, and Double Hunter coming in. So this time around, same thing again. Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue, they're their favorite team, but they're playing some very interesting comps. They're playing a Moonkin, which is something, you know, we definitely haven't seen before. So, but the fact that they are executing everything properly, even though they might be faster if they would be playing something else other than the Moonkin, they're still faster than Oldenscuffed because they're the ones who are not executing it properly. They're the ones who are making those mistakes. So the Moonkin actually working out here for Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue as they are pulling another really big pack here, as the Enchanted Emissary got knocked out a little bit too late, and Morito actually going down.
Yeah, that's not good. They do use the battle res immediately, so not going to have that available again for about 5 minutes or so. Supreme's also procced his staff, and Chin goes down. No battle res available. This is going to be a full team wipe here after they already used their Shadow Melt to skip the Void Emissary earlier, so spoke just a bit too soon about how much Oldenscuffed has to catch up in the dungeon. They've actually killed the boss now and are heading over to the bridge past the Void Emissary that Buff Warrior, as I just mentioned, had to use their Shadow Meld on earlier. So this is a huge disastrous situation. Now, one thing we haven't mentioned yet either is that Buff Warrior ended up using their Bloodlust for trash at the beginning of the dungeon, whereas Oldenscuffed still has 5 minutes on theirs as they used it at the beginning of Sky Captain Craig. So interesting to see from Oldenscuffed. They kind of did a pretty typical pull where they ran past all the trash, Shadow Melded on the bridge, and now they find themselves pretty much in the exact same spot that Buff Warrior had just wiped on. But all of a sudden, Agura, the match is quite close.
Yeah, it's definitely wide open now, as Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue had this huge mistake. Just as I said, they are executing it properly. I guess changed my mind. They're not executing it properly. Unfortunately, having this huge wipe here, I feel like it was miscommunication because the Enchanted Emissary hasn't been dealt with properly, and then on top of that, you had cast going through left and right. So just huge mistake by Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue. And this dungeon is actually quite difficult on fortified and bolstering, just because there's look at the amount of mobs in one pack. right? Executing bolstering properly, the more mobs there are, the more difficult it becomes, especially if you have any sort of AoE that you can't remove. Like, lots of classes have cleave that you can't avoid, like Starfire from a Boomkin, for example, and then lots of abilities from the Unholy DK on top of that. So you definitely want to be careful with that bolstering. Not only can it be dangerous for the tank and for the group if there's any sort of AoE abilities, but it also increases their HP, meaning you need more time to finish them off, even if no one goes down. So definitely want to make sure that you manage the bolstering properly. Oldenscuffed definitely going a little bit slower on their side, but they're executing now probably after their initial wipe that they had at the start.
Yeah, slow and steady wins the race. I mean, we've seen some teams, especially in the lower seeding in some regions, kind of, you know, they pull dungeons more of a high key on live kind of situation, let's say. So, you know, usually 1-2 packs at a time, they take it slow. But sometimes this ends up actually winning the race because some teams that try to just speed demon through the dungeon end up, you know, making a lot of costly mistakes, as we've seen over on the side of Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue. And, you know, one thing that I'm actually going to tout the Boomkin on here is that they actually bring a fair bit of nice utility in these dungeons. So they have that Solar Beam on a 1-minute cooldown, which is, I believe, an 8-second area silence. And then on top of it, they have a lot of the goodies that all the other druids have. They have Entangling Roots, they have a Typhoon on top of it. Treants is hugely beneficial, can be hugely beneficial if played, especially in a necrotic dungeon. So a lot of good coming out of that Boomkin right now. Hopefully they can see it through to the rest of the dungeon as Oldenscuffed is working on the same pack that Buff Warrior just combined with another team, but with another pack here, but they're at 16% now. Buff Warrior already started on the second boss.
Yeah, Force of Nature definitely is something they can make use of, especially in this bolstering environment and in this Freehold specifically. It's an AoE taunt in a small area, and especially if you think about Harlan Suite at the very end of the fight, where you can just taunt mobs in the artillery, in the friendly fire damage from the boss, it can definitely help you out in these kind of scenarios. Or if the tank runs out of defensive cooldowns, especially if you are in voice chat and you communicate your cooldowns, then it's just one additional defensive that you can use, and it's also just hugely beneficial because if your tank would have to kite otherwise, then the mobs spread out, you lose damage because everyone is trying to run for the mobs. Well, if you just have the Force of Nature, everything is standing in place, all the AoE damage can be in one zone, so definitely beneficial there. And Oldenscuffed still working on the trash. Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue definitely caught up again as they're in 30% and they're already fighting on Captain Jolly and Raoul, while Oldenscuffed just going a little bit too slowly on their side.
Yeah, so playing a bit of extra trash on top of the Council of Captains here for Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue. We've seen a lot of teams do this, even in bolstering, just making sure that they finish off the trash at the end. But this is really dangerous right now. A lot of AoE with that barrel smash and the whirlwind area denial coming out. Ching going down to 7%. So much damage coming in, and Loda having a really tough time healing him. His staff is already procced. Not that it had many charges anyway because of the team wipe earlier. Wildgrove's going out all over the team, making sure that everyone's nice and hotted up, healing over time, making sure that they are healthy. Managed to stabilize by the looks of it, but they're not out of the woods just yet as they need to kill the bosses first. Only Raoul is left, and then they can finish off the trashes to make sure not to bolster the bosses here. But that was pretty close there. Yeah,
that was definitely very scary by Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue. They didn't manage to finish off the bosses, so they only have the trash left at this point. You see Eudora still, but Eudora is not actually active in the fight here, so not a problem for them. As soon as they finish up this scrapper, they will get the release point here. Marito can just release and he will spawn right there as we go. And then I assume one of them already triggered the event over at the Ring of Booty, so all they have to do now is go over. And something we've seen a lot from the Western region is that most of those teams will pull a lot of trash on top of this Ring of Booty event, like on top of Ludwig, on top of Trothak, but it's going to be so much more difficult if you have bolstering.
Yeah, I mean, really the only time you can do it is just as they did there on that boss at the end of it, and just try to kill off the boss before you kill the trash. We had bolstering, I believe, last week in West Cup for Atal Dazar, and, you know, we see that all the time as well. So big trash pull coming in here for Buff Warrior, but Tomboy getting just a bit overzealous and getting a few melee strikes before everything stabilizes on top of Ching. Doesn't get killed off, and they do have the checkpoint here at the second boss as Oldenscuffed still hunting around for some trash to kill right now. Looks like they're finally going up to trigger their Council of Captains event, which the server here on the tournament roll right now for this week is set to, as we saw, spawn Jolly and Raoul, meaning they have to go have a swig of that beer up there. Hope I can get one too later. 35% here, trash for Oldenscuffed right now as Buff Warrior hits 39, but they still have quite a big pack of trash that they're about to kill off, waiting for Ludwig to spawn.
Yeah, so Oldenscuffed actually does have their Bloodlust back available. They should probably, it really seems like they could get one extra usage off here, so maybe use it here and then get it again for the last boss, just because there's still so much trash trash that they have to do, and after this boss there's still 2 more, so maybe they should get a third usage off in this dungeon. But for now they are holding their Bloodlust as Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue is engaging Ludwig here. Now, of course, they're not pulling anything on top just yet, but once this boss is lower, they will definitely pull more trash on top. And unfortunately, Supreme does not have Celestial Alignment ready, the 3-minute cooldown that does make Boomkin very strong on those kind of single target fights. But you still have Arcanic Pulsar, meaning that once in a while you can still proc your Celestial Alignment just for a couple of seconds, even if it's on cooldown.
Yeah, but you know, it's all fun and games to talk about the Boomkin here, but I mean, Loda's damage is insane right now. He was actually topping for a bit, and he's sustaining about 20 to 25k constantly. I actually saw it on Council of Captains too. I mean, he's out DPSing while the tank is, you know, not out of the question, but he's out DPSing Tomboy, who's probably saving his cooldowns up for, you know, I would say a rather substantial pull. Indeed, here comes the substantial pull. They've gotten Ludwig down to about 40-45% HP, and now they've combined it with the Emissary Tides on the side and a few Knuckle Dusters and Jugglers, looking to cleave it all down in a merry frenzy together, make sure that nothing over bolsters. Oldenscuffed, on the other hand, still working on the second boss here. They have an average of about 25% between Raul and Jolly here, looking to try and finish that off as their tank Ban gets a bit of a smack there, going down to 20%, but does manage to stabilize with the help of Mash, and they look to finish off that boss. But I mean, at this point, 13% behind on trash. They still have to kill this boss. They still have to do all of the Ring of Booty events that some of them obviously just take time. It takes time for Trothak to spawn, takes time for Ludwig to spawn. They do have a benefit in terms of deaths, but that's not 15 seconds worth.
Yeah, definitely not. And the Ludwig here is actually buffed by Fortified, so it has a lot more HP in this scenario here compared to Tyrannical, meaning that the amount of HP Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue just chewed through, Oldenscuffed has to do as well on top of everything. So now Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue did reach 60% on their enemy forces, and they also have Bloodlust available, but most teams are just saving it for this last fight for Harley and Sweet when they pull a lot of trash on top of the boss at the very start. Now, something they don't want to do this time around with the bowstring, so we'll see what they are choosing to use their Bloodlust on, because that's not really a thing they can do with the bolstering environment here.
Speaking of Bloodlust right now, Oldenscuffed actually pops Bloodlust just as you said that. They pull a bunch of trash there under the stairs on the way to Ludwig. Now, I think this is a double pack in here, but I'm not exactly entirely sure they even started the Ring of Booty event, so I think they just kind of grabbed the trash and went backwards, so that's an extra lot of time and inefficiency that they're going to have to deal with later on. But looks like they have a pretty substantial pull here. Hopefully they can get that Emissary Tides down in order to start interrupting some of those blind rages and, of course, the ricocheting throws going out. Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue, pretty substantial pull. Actually, I think it's the exact same pull that they did, but did not commit their Bloodlust, unlike Oldenscuffed that did on their side. So hopefully these two teams can get it down properly. A lot of damage coming in on Ching right now, trying to stabilize as Loda pours in regrowths all over the place to try and help that tank stay alive.
Yeah, so definitely the scariest part about these pulls is going to be the very last few percentage of the HP of those mobs, because you just can't kill those mobs at the very exact same second. It's just impossible if you have the huge amount of mobs at this very same time. So at some point they are going to bolster, and then you want to make sure that you have your AoE CC ready. Unfortunately, they don't have any AoE stance other than Ching, so they want to make sure that they figure it out properly, and they also want to make sure that they use Vortex, Force of Nature, that kind of stuff as soon as the mobs are low and once they are bolstered. But they did, unfortunately, Loda going down. Now they do have a Belrus available, so Supreme or Tomboy can get them back up, and they also have Bloodlust available, not choosing it to use it yet, and they can't pull anything on top, at least not at the start, because of bolstering too.
Did he just get smacked in the face by that?
So, yeah.
I think he was a little overzealous there and hit the boss before Ching did, and just ended up getting melee, likely crit, but because I don't think you get one shot at their gear level in an 18 fortified, so he probably got crit unluckily by the boss, and that's all it took. Ching here proccing Undulating Tides. Not really sure why he's running it as a tank, not a big fan, but nonetheless, this is what the team has practiced, so not going to have that available again for 45 seconds. In fact, nor will Loda, who has the bleed application from the boss. Everybody is huddled up in there trying to get some extra damage in. Now, one of the advantages, of course, actually coming out of the Boomkin as well, is that the rest of Druid can then get in on Trothak and start doing a lot of that feral cat damage that we know they like to do, as opposed to needing to stay out and constantly kite the sharks around in circles. But it seems Loda is actually still doing that, allowing Supreme to just park and plant and DPS. Now, I'm not, I know about a few of the range classes, of course, at relative depth, but for Boomkin's Dagor, I'm not sure how much they're affected by movement with their DPS rotation.
Unfortunately, they're affected a lot by movement, so that's probably why Loda is still taking that shark. Moonkin's definitely wants to just stand still and cast abilities. There's not that many things a Moonkin can do while walking other than using those instant casts like the Star Surge or reapplying the dots, but you do need the astral power to do that. So once you run out of resources, you don't really have that many things to do while walking. That's why Loda is still trying to kite it around, as you can see for Buff War Nerf Rogue here. So Boss is on 30%. At this point, they could pull some more trash on top of it if they wanted to. While Oldnscuffed still working on trash, they're catching up slightly on the trash percentage, but there's still Ludwig left they have to do. And as I mentioned before, it has a lot of HP on Fortified as well. So just a lot of... They're so far behind at this point. Even with the 4 death difference, the 20 seconds is not going to make up for it.
No, it's not going to make up for it at all. And I mean, they need a couple of wipes out of Buff Warrior in order to even have a chance of catching up right now. They are at 8 deaths though, Buff Warrior and Nerf Rogue, so not exactly the cleanest run we've seen from them in general. But speaking of Boomkins, I mean, Supreme is pumping the single target damage right now. I mean, well above Morito and Tomboy, as finally Trothak falls here for Buff Warrior and Nerf Rogue, and they get ready to likely cross the bridge soon. They're already at 80% now. Of course, in this dungeon, you know, in previous weeks, we're used to seeing all the teams kind of just gang a huge pile of mobs on top of Harlan's suite, get all of the cannonball barrage to help them cleave it down. You can't really do that, at least not until the very end of the fight, just because of bolstering. So everything is going to be separated for a pretty substantial amount of time, increasing the amount of time that'll take for them to kill, unless they want to deal with some of the trash early.
Yeah, so this 20% is, I mean, that's a lot. We see Tomboy actually just trying to Shadow Melt on this set because he has no way of jumping up on the ledge like all the other classes can with their leap, their wild charge. Moonkin also running a wild charge so they can just jump on top of the rogue who can grappling hook up there. So Tomboy is actually doing a good job for not dying there, because a lot of other teams we've seen before, they just had their DK die and rest them back up. So good on Tomboy to be able to do this without having to use one death. Now, they are not doing this pull as we talked about earlier because it is bolstering, but they have been saving their bloodlust this whole time. So there's definitely something they want to do. I assume they want to pull trash until at the very end when the boss has a damage increase and when this artillery or the bombardment, you can see, hits everybody in the whole group, and then just down a huge amount of trash, maybe at the very same time at the end.
Yeah, Nagar, are you feeling all right today? Because usually your assumption by the end of the dungeon when saving Bloodlust for so long is that they're saving it for the next dungeon or they've forgotten. So interesting for me to see them, to see you give them the benefit of the doubt. But that's exactly what we'll do here, and we'll see exactly where they use it as Harlan's Suite hits 72% now, about 10% off from the second phase where he will start to affect everybody with that Cannonball Barrage, and of course improve his slicing winds to a 360-degree circle. So one more barrage coming down. I suspect that likely they'll pull something on top of him in the third phase when he's taking double damage, which is sub 30%. There's just a lot less room for error, and you can just turn and burn Harlan's Suite early if needed if you mismanage the trash. But Oldnscuffed here, dealing just solo with one of the Demolishers on the side, not exactly what you like to see. It's very inefficient, not to mention it's just one mob, high amount of health, but melee also, they're running a heavy melee comp, and you can't even get in there a lot of the time because of the AoE constantly.
Yeah, so I've seen him pull a Demolisher earlier as well, and I wanted to talk about it and say how inefficient it is, but maybe they just chose to do that because they didn't want to deal with the bolstering of the other trash packs that they have to pull. Maybe they just don't know how to handle it properly and just figured we're just gonna pull a single target mob to get our percentage while we wait for Trothak to spawn. Now, Buff War Nerf Rogue finally did use their Bloodlust. Supreme unfortunately going down to the mobs here with the fixate, so it did reach Supreme and he got one shot by the explosion. Thankfully, he did not use his cooldowns before he went down, but he lost the Bloodlust.
I don't know. Wouldn't have happened to a rogue, that's all I can say. It's Supreme. They don't have the battle res available, as mentioned, but they should have it in about 20 seconds or so here. I'm not sure if it's going to be worth using it at that point. Harlan's Suite is entering his last phase in just a moment and will be burned down very quickly. Just depends if they want to combine it with any of the trash that surrounds, because 20% trash and bolstering Freehold is actually still a fair bit that they have to deal with at the end of this. Oldnscuffed here, 50% now on Trothak, and they said it's 68% trash. Had accrued one more death on the board, putting them up to 5 before Nerf Rogue, of course, did match that with Supreme going down earlier, so the difference of 20 seconds or 4 deaths is still present between the two teams, but Buff War and Nerf Rogue is absolute light years ahead in this dungeon right now as Harlan's Suite falls to 15%.
Okay, so I know what Supreme's plan was here. He had all of his cooldowns ready, and I was looking at it. I was wondering why he's not using his cooldowns. Even with the Bloodlust, he didn't use it. So what he actually wanted to do, he wanted to wait for Harlan's Suite to be below 30%, so he gets the damage increase, and then he pops all his cooldowns, and then he tops the damage just to look good on stream and get Moonkin's buffed. So shout out to Supreme for the effort trying to get Moonkin's buffed. Unfortunately, it didn't help as he did go down.
Well, as he did go down, but what might help his case is the fact that he was the lowest amount of damage,
Maybe.
even under the healer. So, you know, perhaps who's really outsmarted here, Nagura. But 83% now for Buff War and Nerf Rogue as they deal with these rather bolstered and Enforcers for the 6-pack right in front of Harlan Sweet. Oftentimes we see this mass pull come in with a Bloodlust on top of Harlan. They're killed off with the Cannonball Barrage, as mentioned. Can't really do that here in this bolstering environment. So they're kind of running all over the place. A lot of damage coming in on Jing as he gets tossed around. I can feel his pain. That is the most frustrating thing in the world as a tank to get that shattering throw. Tryhard here, 2% for Oldnscuffed as they look to finish that boss off. But Buff Warrior, Nerf Rogue already on the hunt for the final 10% trash.
Yeah, so the last 10% is not going to be too difficult for them. The only thing that might be a problem is the Void-Touched Emissary here that you can see. That's why most teams are not pulling this trash by itself, but rather just pull it on top and then try to outrange the Void-Touched Emissary or line of sight. But there's Ravagers in this pack, and the Ravagers do cast a painful motivation, meaning that they are damaging themselves and they just finish off the mobs. And there we go, 100% trash for Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue.
Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue taking that first victory of the day, taking that Freehold pretty handily. They had some mistakes. We got to see a little wipe on their side of it, but overall, this has just been the kind of idea for them is that, hey, let's play some different off-meta classes. Let's change up our strategy a little bit here. Let's get the job done.
Yeah, more like Buff Boomkin Nerf Rogue.
Oh, you should have seen the smile on his face when he heard about it.
Dude, I like Moonkin, of course. Like,
of course.
What do you think about Supreme dying there at the last boss?
Well, I mean, sometimes getting hit by the Grenadier is not exactly the most optimal thing whenever you're looking to root that.
Is it very relatable to you?
More than I would like it to be.
Unfortunate onto that end, but
Diabolical Moonkin wipers this side of the Mississippi.
Yeah, but Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue, I'm just gonna let that go. Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue ended up they had some issues with just like the pull. It looked like they had multiple Frost Blasts going off during their wipe, but all in all, this was like a pretty clean run from them, even with this pretty different comp that we're seeing them run. A lot of the times we've been seeing like a double Unholy Death Knight meta, but the fact that they were even able to like think about playing potentially new stuff, and Supreme doing just like a ton of damage on Trothak there, we've talked about it in the back a lot, and it feels like the meta is very stale because people are unwilling to innovate. I feel like there's definitely a place for other classes, not specifically Moonkin, but like potentially stuff like Fire Mage. I know we've seen a lot of Mistweaver Monk coming through. The double Unholy Death Knight took literally nerfing rogues for people to even be looking to innovate new meta picks, so it's really nice from Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue to see the fact that they're even like looking to play new stuff here.
Yeah, that's an interesting point as you raised, and looking at like Mistweaver as a great example on that one. We saw maybe one Mistweaver from Zmok in week 1 from the West. We saw just a little bit of it, and then it started coming in a little bit more from the top 3-4 teams or something like that in week 2, and then by week 3, everybody was running Mistweaver for Underrod and a couple other dungeons like Wakecrest or something like that, right? We started just seeing it overwhelmingly highly represented in that end, and it's a very good point is maybe not Moonkin on that end, but start looking at some other classes, and this is their opportunity before BlizzCon, especially for some of those teams, to start saying, all right, well, where do we want to start changing things up? What might be good? And let's try it out, because in many cases, the meta gets kind of stale because you also have to worry a little bit, Salute, about falling behind. Because if you're spending so much practice time working on which classes are going to work, then you're taking time away from how can we execute better with a comp we know works.
Yeah, it's really a weird, fickle situation because I mean it's not as easy as just play a bunch of new classes forehead and you know we'll just succeed and let's bring a Guardian Druid and all this kind of stuff. It just doesn't work that way. I mean, these teams have limited practice time. They're told limited amount of days before the time trial, before the cups happen, and it's much easier, like Jack is saying, to go back to your comfort pick sometimes, even if it might not be that ideal. So I think part of the advantage with some of the teams that come out is having those players that innately play other classes as mains on live, and then they're comfortable enough to step in and say, hey, you know what would be really good here? Maybe we bring a Boomkin to Freehold, and then you start seeing these develops unravel and idealize on the kind of big platform here at the MDI, and it starts to spiral if it catches on like the Mistweavers did.
Yeah, most definitely out of that end. Sorry, Tuttles?
Yeah, and then even we had like the Vengeance, Demon Hunter, and Siege of Borealis. Like, it just requires you to be looking to play something like that on live, or have like a really good theoretical understanding of where the class is good prior to even coming into it, because it like you said, it requires a ton of practice to be able to make sure that the pulls will go in a way that you would prefer them to, and you're not just like wasting practice time at the end of the day, because that would be a major concern.
Yep, time management is going to be the name of the game, especially in our speed running environment. We'll be taking a quick break to manage our own time before we get into game number 2. Don't go anywhere, guys. The MDI will be back after a short break. Welcome back to the Mythic Dungeon International as our first series of the day is underway between Buff War, Nerf Rogue, and Oldnscuffed. And while Buff War and Nerf Rogue did take that first game on Freehold, we're coming back to Dagor, and onto this one, we always seem to have explosive or necrotic. We're finally kind of going easy on him this time with some Grievous here, Sloot.
Yeah, no Sanguine, no Necrotic, no Explosive, so this should be a relative breeze. I mean, you can already start talking about, yeah, you know, Grievous sometimes gets out of hand and skittish for the cannons, but, like, in reality, there's no way ever that these affixes should be a problem for these teams. I mean, you know, if there's a mass pull coming into the start on top of the Sand Queen, maybe the tank might snap loose thread if there's, you know, an Unholy DK and there's something like that with Skittish, but it shouldn't be a huge concern, really.
Well, that was an interesting point, because didn't we see last week on Dagor where how easily it is for other players to rip threat, even without the Skittish affix on top of it, losing some people in the very beginning of a pull, and you're just having all kinds of issues.
And that's where that Unholy Death Knight comes in with the Night Elf racial. I know that whenever they start prepping their damage, they need to use like Night Elf to drop combat to make sure they're not going to rip threat off their tank.
Huh, good to know onto that one. Let's take it away, guys. Dagor getting started.
Yeah, but speaking of those unholy DKs, there are none here, so it doesn't even matter right now. So we have double Tricks of the Trade on each side, so they can help transfer some of that temporary threat over a 30-second period to their tank. But it looks like at least Buff Warrior's side is rearing up to do a pretty substantial pull, I believe, with the boss. Yep, here comes the Sand Queen right now, Nagura, but Oldnscuffed looks like they're just focusing, kind of like what we saw in the last dungeon, just trash and then boss.
Yeah, very interesting to see that they're not playing the DK anymore in Buff Warrior's rogue side. I mean, I'm not surprised they don't play the Boomkin anymore.
What?
But the fact that they don't play the DK, because I really like the strategy that I've seen from the Western region last weekend, where he just made use of this DK damage on this very first pull. As you can see, Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue, though, is still doing a big pull on top of the boss, just not having this DK, meaning things are going to die a little bit slower, and maybe they can just get away with not running the DK, because there are no affixes really making this kind of pull too difficult. There's nothing like Necrotic that we've seen last weekend to make this more difficult, so therefore it's not too big of a problem for them if those mobs don't die immediately.
Yeah, surprisingly modest pull here coming out of them. I'm kind of shocked to see this, because as you said, there's really nothing preventing them from doing so. Oldnscuffed taking it even slower though right now as they're finishing off most of their remaining trash, probably getting to about 10-11% in just a moment as those two Vice Jaws go down. Yeah, so there's a 10% on the board, and it looks like Ban is moving off screen, or moving just a bit off screen to grab a couple more mobs on top of the Sand Queen. So they do try to combine it with a bit of relative efficiency. A lot of damage coming in here for Buff Warrior right now. Ching getting down to 6% as the Sand Queen pops up and says hello. Nobody has fallen here as the Sand Queen hits 45%, but huge struggles coming in from Loda. He's already procced his Undulating Tides. He just committed his Tranquility as well. Supreme just can't get out of this 4-stack right now. He has Parasite debuffs all over him, which is a pretty heavy dot, and then snowballing into that Grievous. I mean, this is starting to get a bit out of hand, quite sloppy.
And that was such a huge problem here for Loda to keep his group alive, as all of them just ramped up the Grievous stacks on them, and there were so many ads applying those dots to all of the group, meaning everyone takes damage, everyone has Grievous on top of everything, so Loda having a hard time keeping his group alive. But with the Trank and some other cooldowns coming in, he did manage to recover now, finally. Supreme did proc his cheat death, did not go down though, as Ching also drops very low, has some trouble. They have trouble finishing off those ads, so maybe having this DK might actually be helping them out here, but they seem to have recovered now, and the Sand Queen is a 9%, so they should be fine to finish it off.
Yeah, that upheaval on Ching there was actually really scary. Popped his ablative as well, and then yeah, those drones, they just add a stacking damage over time effect on their target. So because of Skittish, as they pulled some of the trash coming in on top of the ones that the boss already spawns, they were just, you know, players were ripping aggro, and all it takes is, you know, just a moment or two of aggro. You get 2 dots of that, it spirals into 4-stack of Grievous, and poor Loda fell quite behind, but did an excellent job to make sure that nobody on his team fell as they hit 0 deaths still, and they head upstairs to the buff floor, if you will, where all the caged buff NPCs are that can help the players out. 11% on trash, still 0 deaths on the board, and it looks like they will be largely ignoring the other side, whereas we've seen some teams do a more aggressive pull on this floor, Nagura, to try and get all 4 buffs, but they don't want anything to do with that.
Yeah, it actually seems like they're not even opening any of the cages at all, as both of the rogues just went through, or they just went up for the step and then go back, but it looks like none of the rogues are trying to get the buffs, so they're all up on the Jess Howless floor now. We might see a trash pull first, or they're gonna go into Jess Howless straight away. Unfortunately, Oldnscuffed has to arrest with that, so there's no one who can get them back up, and on 26% on the Sand Queen, this might be really difficult for them because of the Grievous affix, making it so hard for the tanks to survive here.
There's no way. The one of the main weaknesses of Warriors that just they don't have any self-sustain in terms of healing. Absolutely 0. In fact, he's likely wearing Urchin, I would guess. I'll have to double check after. That's the only thing really kind of ticking his health right now. The Windwalker's already dead, so he can't help. Ban finally goes down, and it's like it's going to be a heartbreakingly low % 50% wipe on Oldnscuffed as the two rogues do everything they can, but the Sand Queen unfortunately goes back down for another round of upheaval, targeting one of the rogues on the side. They do manage to skip it well, but I mean, even cheat death won't prevent the incoming slaughter here, as Sand Queen is now down to 6%, and both rogues will be finished off here. Jess Hallis, though, on the bright side, has been pulled here for buff warrior nerf rogue, and they're dealing with her. It's been pulled through the wall, of course, from Burrito with his chi. It wasn't a torpedo. It was chi burst. That's what. Chi burst. Yeah. So that's what he was using to pull through. Or rising sun kick, I believe, works as well. So they're just working on just Hallis now before he does his round at 70%.
Yeah, that was heartbreaking, to be honest, because it seemed like they were calling a wipe a little bit too early on Oldnscuffed. They figured they're not going to be able to finish it off, and therefore they didn't even commit their defensive cooldowns. I believe the warrior even had defensive like shield ball ready in last stand, but didn't commit to it because they probably called that they are going to wipe. But at the end, in the end, the Sand Queen went all the way down to like 3 or 4%. So if they would have committed their defensives, they probably would have been able to finish it off. So heartbreaking on their side to not commit those defensives and finish it off anyway. As buff warrior rogue is already in phase 2 of Jess Hallis, and now you're gonna have Bobby that needs to be interrupted on top of also having to interrupt the boss, and you have a bunch of raiders here. Now, thankfully, again, there's nothing like necrotic that will make this harder on the tank, and no explosive. So as long as they interrupt all the cast, they should be fine. But we've seen some fears go through in the past here in this boss.
Yeah, we have indeed, but the team does well here to line of sight. That flashing dagger is coming in from Jess Hallis. Fears are indeed interrupted on both Bobby and Jess. Bobby should be running off in just a moment to do his ranged fear, if you will. Sev, just a bit of damage coming in here as we see various stacks go up on the DPS members of Oldnscuffed, just leading to a difficult time for the healer. But it looks like Mash is on top of it, unlike, no, I don't want to say Loda wasn't on top of it when they were doing Sand Queen, but he's certainly not letting himself get to the point where, you know, 4 members are sitting at 4 stacks of Grievous. So nice and controlled here as they have done their second pull on Sand Queen now, who goes down for another upheaval phase, targeted on the tank. Now he can, of course, heroic leap that, but decides to just shield wall instead and eat the hit with a 40% DR instead. Jess Hallis here down to 2% for buff warrior nerf rogue, who sits at 25% trash. But again, the Resto Druid going down here for Oldnscuffed, and the Sand Queen is way too high this time to be able to be soloed down. So it looks like they're going to try to reset her by running away. I don't even know if she leashes at this point.
And this is a big problem for Oldnscuffed. I believe it's just Grievous and Skittish making this fight so much more difficult. Having all of those, having all of the drones running around, and then the healer, you want to stand still and heal the members up. But if you stand still and you don't follow the tank around, then you're gonna get aggro from the drones, and it's so hard from the tank to get the aggro off of you if you're not on top of the tank. So definitely a difficult fight to heal as a Resto Druid, especially with this Grievous affix. Even on Fortified, just making it so hard to deal with for the Resto Druids here, as buff warrior rogue is already in the cannon area. They're dealing with this Void Touch Emissary first, and once they're done with this, almost getting the last cast off here, they're going to be able to ramp up a pretty big pull and then deal with it with those cannons.
Yeah, so a lot of damage coming in here on Ching again, who once again procs is undulating. Stop running undulating in these speed competitions. It's just a dead talent after 45 seconds, because you know, if you do big dangerous pulls like this, you know you're going to dip below 50% a lot of the time, and then you're just running a dead Azerite choice for a while. But, you know, some tanks do run it, I guess, for the safety net, because it does give you that rather substantial absorb if you dip below 50. So I don't know if that's why he's running it, but nonetheless, buff warrior nerf rogue here, 27%. They have dealt with that dangerous Void Emissary on this balcony that, of course, will have one more in the corner near the cannon to deal with once they get past Knight Captain Valeri. But let's not get to that point just yet as they look to get around the corner here. Suppression fire is coming in from the Marines right now. And this is where I've seen a lot of tanks and really teams have issues with some of the pulls, because the officers make this a nightmare. So they're trying to do kind of that line of sight tactic again, Nagura, where they trail all of the officers around the corner. But because there's so many casters and the Marines which are arranged, it really makes it hard to group everything up. Yeah,
it definitely makes it hard. As you can see, Jing just trying to line of sight at the same time as kiting them off, but you can see they're definitely not stacked up by any means. Now, unfortunately, Supreme and Tomboy don't have their cloak ready at this point, which will make it a little bit harder to deal with the cannon part later. But it seems like they want to finish off this trash pack before they even go and use the cannons at all. So they want to make this middle way clear. It seems like they want to use both of the cannons for their next pull, where the tank is going to go inside the house, just get as much trash trash as possible, and then probably use both of the cannons to be able to deal with one big pull, and that's why they're clearing this this hallway here.
Yeah, Supreme unfortunately proccing his cheat death there, so he's not going to available again for 6 minutes. So Ching once again proccing Undulating Tides, like right back up after he procced it the previous time, dealing with the rest of these officers that do hit quite hard. And there's a bit of, I don't want to say splash damage on the group, but it is easily get frontaled by the Marine suppression fire, or just caught with one of the ignites on the ground from the casters, and I believe that's what caught Supreme and made him proc his cheat death. But fortunately, still 0 deaths on the board for Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue. That has now cleared the entirety of the balcony before the Knight Captain Valyri trash. So it looks like they might be getting ready for a double cannon strat where they pull most of the room together here. They do have the benefit of the Ring of Peace, Typhoon, and Ursul's Vortex coming in from Loda and Morito. So we're going to see if they only use 1 cannon or 2 for this, but nonetheless, here comes the big pull.
Yeah, so you can see Ching just line of sighting here, making sure all of the mobs gather up in this very tiny area here. And once they are gathered here on the side, you can use all of your siege so efficiently. You can use the Ring of Peace and the Vortex, as we've talked about. There's the stun coming out of Ching, and now we see the cannon cast being used. Now, obviously, the cannons have been changed, and there's only 5 shots in each cannon, and then they're depleted, and you can't use them anymore. And this is why it's so crucial to be able to stack up the mobs on one very specific point, so you get the cannon shots on all of them. And even though they didn't finish off all of the mobs with the 5 cannon shots from the first cannon, they're just going to use the second cannon here to deal with the rest of the mobs. Yeah,
they're indeed doing a 2 cannon strat, if you will. Morito still has about 15 seconds left on that Ring of Peace cooldown, waiting for it to come up before he will help regather all the mobs. But part of the difficulty with grouping all of these is is not even the fact that you pull them all at different times, but they all just have random abilities that they stop to cast. So you see the shoots coming in from the Marines, you see the handcuffs, and of course the riot shields that come in frequently from the officers. You have the flame casters doing their thing, and so just because of this, they tend to naturally spread out a lot, and it makes it a nightmare for the players, which is why Ring of Peace is so good to group them together. Final Marine here about to fall, as they, I believe, saw 3 cannon shots on this last cannon, so 80% still. They need to get in the high 80s of percent before moving over to the Knight Captain Valyri, post Knight Captain Valyri trash. So they will have to deal with this trash coming up. You can already see Ching popping his Sky Step, getting in there, getting threat on everything, and then rounding it around in the corner.
It was actually, so this pull was actually very beautifully done by Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue. This whole cannon area just so well done, but I'm so clean. You can see all of the mobs just being stacked on this one point, not even needing all of 10 cannon shots to deal with this huge pull that they did inside of the area. So just very well done by Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue to deal with this. Unfortunately, Oldnscuffed are having some issues here as they're fighting some trash in this area, but hopefully their healer can stay alive, and then they can mass rest once they're done with this thug.
Yeah, no, it was really well done by them. They did lose a bit of time because of mismanagement on that Enchanted Emissary, unfortunately, which ended up parking on top of the nicely grouped pack of mobs. So nobody really wanted to get in there, and they were scared. They didn't want to reflect 200% of that damage back onto themselves, but they did manage to get through that cleanly, nonetheless, as Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue has started here on Knight Captain Valyri, the 3rd boss of the dungeon. They're perfectly 90% trash, so they have exactly the percent they need before they finish all of the Korgus trash off before the 4th boss. But one step at a time, make sure this boss is kept in the corners and out of explosive radius so that all the melee have nice access to her, and barrel control is absolute key, as we've seen. Oldnscuffed here, checking in on them, are having a lot of trouble. I mean, they're still at 13% on the board. They're currently looking at the stairs getting up to the Jess Howlis room. I guess they didn't have any, no, they don't have any shrouds. No, they do have a shroud available from Zesh. I'm not really sure why they're not using it. I guess they're actually dealing with this trash. So it looks like they run up past the double salt speaker or C speaker pull right now that most teams just avoid completely, and they're looking like they're dealing with that, but to not much avail as Bandux goes down again. They have a battle res available, but trash is going to be all over the place. It does come up. He's going to have a nightmare getting threat on everything here.
Yeah, unfortunately, a healer going down, so this is going to be a full team wipe, and there's no way of, even if the rogue survives or manages to vanish off the aggro, there's no way of him getting up the healer, so they have to release and go back. Now, fortunately, they actually finished off this one thug who has True Sight that is standing in front of the door because they mismanaged a skip earlier. So they would be able to go past there. But there's one Vortex Emissary here that they will be in combat with, and the only way for them to drop combat is to use Shadow Mail, which all of them have cooldown right now. So they're choosing to deal with this Void Touch damage. They're just costing them so much time to get back to the point where they were before. And this is a problem in Dagor in general. If you have one of those wipes and your healer dies and you can't get your group back up, you lose so much time because of all the skips that you did beforehand. There's just so many skips going on because you want to deal with most of the trash in this cannon area, just being so much more efficient. Buff Warrior Rogue did down Valeri as they're on their way to get their last 10% of trash before they go to the last boss.
Yeah, so they do have this last Void Touch emissary, something that Oldnscuffed had to deal with in the base of the sewers there. So Buff Warrior Rogue dealing with the final percentages of trash that they need. So triple Warden here with 2 priests as well, not to mention the Void Touch Emissary, and it looks like they're going for a strat where they ignore the Void Emissary. Now, most teams we see just kind of get in there, kill the Void Emissary right away to make their life easy and get access to the cannon, whereas some teams, more rarely, will completely ignore the Void Emissary, use the cannon on the side while they sit kind of line of sight. But Ching, and I was just about to say, the danger with that is that if you don't line of sight while you're tanking the mobs or dealing with what you're dealing with, standing in the cannon, if you will, you can get clipped. So Ching there got meleeed on top of one of the explosions from the Void Emissary, and it was just enough to chunk him down and finish him off. So bit of a sloppy death, but they did manage to kill off the rest of the mobs. Everybody else shadow melded, and now they're rezzing Ching.
Isn't this the exact same thing that happened to one of the western regions where they had an absolutely clean run up until this very last point? I think it was Abra, where one of the rogues killed the Divine Field with the cannons on this very last pack. So the exact same thing happened here, as unfortunately Ching goes down. But now they are engaging the last boss. They saved their bloodlust till this point, and now they're going to try to finish off this boss as fast as they can. And look at the final time. It's pretty fast. It's around 15-16 minutes, so definitely can compete with some of the times from the western region as well. So really good run by Buff Warrior Rogue as they're fighting the last boss, Korgis, which on a 45 setting really shouldn't be as big of a problem, but it is grievous, so it definitely makes it a little bit harder on Loda to heal up those explosive bursts.
But what about the doubles, Nagura?
And the doubles.
The doubles of explosive bursts, not what you want to see on this boss. Another rogue death here for Oldnscuffed right now, putting them to 24 deaths and showing why their team name is Oldnscuffed with this dungeon run here right now as Korgis gets down to 58% for Buff Warrior, which should be able to cruise through the rest of this. I mean, they're just light years ahead right now. Even several wipes won't put Oldnscuffed back. They just had too much struggles with the trash and moving too slowly. They haven't even gotten started on Jess. So 45% now. Overseer Korgis should see Buff Warrior on to the next series in just a moment. But you know, this map was good for the most part. I mean, one death is good for Buff Warrior for the caliber of their team, but they did move a bit slow, and we did see some sloppiness come out of them, Nagura, in the previous series as well.
Yeah, most definitely. I really like their cannon parts, but again, it seemed like their cannon part, it looked very clean, but maybe it just took them too much time to set it up there, and that's something we've talked about before, especially for Buff Warrior Rogue, when they were running this Vengeance Demon Hunter, and it looked very clean, but the amount of time it takes you to set these kind of pulls up is just too long. So even if it looks clean, it's not going to be the fastest, and you want the fastest strategy and not the cleanest one. So maybe you still need to improve their time a little bit here in Dagor for the BlizzCon that we're going to see later.
Overseer Korgis now down to say, you know, you do want a fast and clean run. There is such a thing. They're not mutually exclusive terms, but Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue here, 2% Korgis, and downs the final boss, taking the first series of this East Cup weekend 2-0.
Before Nerf Rogue taking the sweep, moving on throughout the bracket and sending Oldnscuffed down to the lower. And they had a pretty solid run in Dagor, and I think a lot of times when we start looking at some of these teams, how they're going to start matching up against the Western region in particular, we start looking at what are those key moments, what are they missing compared to one of those Western team settles, and I think for both of those dungeons, they had most of the pieces there, but maybe it's just not them going as strenuous with practice.
Yeah, and it felt like they are, because it feels like Buff Warrior Rogue is a world-class team in their own regard, but then there was just like some things like how they ended up dealing with like the cannon area, where we'll see a lot of West Cup teams ending up pulling like all of the trash that is on like that walkway area with like the huge pull that is inside of that is inside of that area, and doing it all together using both cannons to merge. The pull that Buff Warrior Rogue did in like literally a minute and a half, Ching was literally just like running around out of line of sight, making sure that nobody was going to die. No cannons were used for both of those two packs together. It just cost them a bunch of time, but it feels like the pieces are there, and it feels like if they if they were really going all out, they would be able to turn it into like a world-class run. Because what they had was like a 16-minute run, which all in all isn't that bad. Especially with some mistakes like the Watery Dome going out on Jess right here, it just like costs you a little bit of time where otherwise you would not need it. And then just cleaning up their cannon play a little bit would help their Dagor run by a significant margin. Same thing goes with Freehold. I liked how they skipped around the Council of Captains a little bit early on, but then they had some issues with like Frost Blast going off, wiping their whole entire group. Of course, they're playing maybe not the most optimal comp for that dungeon. However, it requires a little bit more preparation, a little bit more cleanliness. But Buff War Nerf Rogue, they are a world-class team, and they are very good, especially at this dungeon. Dagor, only one death coming through. Really nice run for them.
That's right, and around that 16 kind of minute mark. So sort of mentioned previously how we're seeing teams around that 13, 14 minute or something like that. So they have a couple areas in particular to clean up, but this is going to be pushing them into the upper bracket. And then they'll be able to kind of get a good idea in the future and say, all right, when we have to deal with these certain affixes, we can start looking at how we need to adjust our strategy. So with Buff War Nerf Rogue moving on, then we are going to be looking at Oldnscuffed getting dropped down into that lower bracket. So we'll see them again a little bit later on, depending on our next matchups onto that one. So Bluebird, of course, having that forfeit. So King of Ruins is going to be moving on into the upper semis, which is going to be bringing us into Black Mamba and the return, the one, the only, the big money crab.
I'm really excited.
I'm
Why
excited
are you
too.
really excited here?
For the Big Papa, of course.
Oh,
All a big fan here under the desk. And